If you're anything like me, you love the feeling like you've assembled Exodia when playing Magic. Making plays that feel like you've surely read the cards wrong, like they can't be that broken. Don't get me wrong, I don't mean simply playing a Dockside Extortionist and making 20 mana. That is bullshit. Rather, I mean assembling the pieces to your own unique puzzle and doing ridiculously big, flashy, and game-breaking things that are powered by your brain, more so than your wallet. This budget spell Slinger deck does just that and then some. Enter Galazeth Prismari, a card that I've known about for ages, but never really paid much attention to. Nor have I seen anyone else do much with him. Maybe I've just been living under a rock and the comments will be filled with cries of, "What do you mean? He's broken." And "He rules my LGS with a treasure-coated fist." But still, me? Not so much. He's got reasonable stats, being a 3/4 flyer for 4 mana that makes a treasure when he enters the battlefield. The important bit, though, is that artifacts you control can tap to add 1 mana of any color, which can only be spent to cast instant or sorcery spells. With the right build, this is just nuts, where your limits aren't how much mana you have, but rather whether you can use all your mana. So why should you build this deck? Well, do you like lots of mana? Do you like casting big spells? Do you like burninating the fields? Then you've got 3 perfectly good reasons that this should be your next deck. At the risk of explaining the obvious, this deck aims to build a large board of artifacts, then use Galazeth to turn them into mana rocks. Most of the deck, be that creatures, card draw, counterspells, or removal, will make some mana as a byproduct. You then use all that mana to cast big, powerful spells. As I've already hinted at, my win con of choice is huge burn spells. So how do we get there? In the early game, you're going to want to build up your board of artifacts, so that when you play your commander, you'll have enough mana up to cast a spell. Ideally, a counterspell to protect him. This means that in your opening hand, you'll typically want about 3 lands and either cheap artifacts or spells that make you artifact tokens. This deck draws a lot of cards, so don't feel bad for not having any big flashy spells in your opening hand. You actively don't want them. Once you've cast your commander, you're going to want to spend the next few turns continuing to build up your board. As long as you're progressing your board state every turn, you're on the right track. Typically, you'll be drawing a bunch of cards, making treasures, clues, and artifact creatures as a byproduct. When you get to the late game and you've got heaps of artifacts, you'll start casting your big, game-breaking spells. There aren't many of these in the deck, so your sole goal is to build up as much mana as you can and spend it firing off these big X spells. For example, making 20 clues and likely doubling your mana at instant speed. Or perhaps drawing 20 cards worth Finale of Revelation. Or finishing the game and nuking your opponents with 20 damage with Comet Storm at instant speed. That is, ironically, the speed at which you should like this video, as well as subscribe to this, a very base deck building channel. When it comes to deck construction, I find budget decks really need to be focused and almost one-dimensional to be successful. And this one's no different. Everything in this deck exists to support the casting of your big X spells. Let's take a look at some of the cards in the deck. One thing I love about this deck is not having to devote slots to mana rocks. Given any artifact you play becomes a mana rock, it makes sense to play a whole bunch of other good early game artifacts. This deck is really resource hungry, so the goal here is to get lots more cards and token mana sources, and add things that synergize with both of these effects. Creatures definitely aren't the focus of the deck, and the ones that do exist are here mostly for artifact creation. Gale is an exception, and exists mostly so that you're able to fish win cons out of your graveyard in the late game if you need to. This is probably a section that will raise a couple of eyebrows, as the deck is definitely light on removal, but between our early game creatures, Thopters, constructs, and the removal that we do have, it's usually enough unless we get heavily targeted. Counterspells in this deck exist largely to protect your commander, and to make sure that a Vandal Blast never, ever resolves. It's worth calling out just how good the 5 mana counterspells in this deck feel to play. But if you build this deck, you'll see exactly what I mean. With this being a very resource-hungry deck, cards are very good. The latter 6 spells on this list feel especially good, as they get you cards, but also ramp for mana. Speaking of mana, these are the engines of the deck, most of which really ramp up your board state. They each shine in their own way, but Academy Manufactor is, as he often is, really, really broken. Gadrak plus Earthquake will often net you 10 treasures. Trail of Evidence ramps you 2 mana per turn. And Detective Satchel just feels absolutely busted to play on turn 4, as it ramps you by 4 mana in 1 turn. Lastly, our big hitters exist solely to abuse our ample mana. There's not going to be any 15-minute storm turns here. Instead, we'll just tap 30 mana, burn out our opponents, and have a counterspell backup to make sure the win goes through. If you're up against any lifelink shenanigans, a flashbacked Increasing Vengeance should do just the trick. There are lots of cards that almost made the cut, but didn't, mostly because they just didn't synergize quite how I wanted them to, or they were just too expensive for this, a budget brew. If you want to get my thoughts on any particular card that was cut and why it didn't make the list, or perhaps you want my justification for one that did, let me know in the comments. To wrap things up, let's talk about upgrades. This is, after all, a $50 deck, so there's lots of room to throw more money at it. If you do, I think the ceiling for this deck's power is incredibly high. Likewise, so is the monetary ceiling. From good artifacts to flashy spells, you really could upgrade most of the cards in the deck. That said, I feel like if you're chasing power, somewhere along the way, it's quite easy to lose this deck's identity, trading synergy and fun janky cards for good stuff type power. And I'm not sure if it's worth it. All that said, here are some of the cards I think would be beneficial to add to the deck if you've got some money to burn.